Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar from the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. My name is Eric Evanson, and I am NAFC's Science Communications Specialist, and very excited that you're all here to join us today. Now, before we get started, what I would like to remind everybody is that NAFC is part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. And as you can see on the map there are 15 exchanges all across the country. And if you want to learn more about any of the other exchanges or about the Joint Fire Science Program, we encourage you to visit firescience.gov. Now, today's webinar is taking care of our home Northeastern Indigenous land stewardship practices and caring for the land today. And our presenter is Shlomia Lightfoot. She is the founder and executive director of the Indigenous Landscape Initiative, or Inland for short. Now, the way the presentation will go is Shlomia will give her presentation first, and then we'll follow that up with a question and answer session at the end. Now, if at any point during the presentation you have a question, feel free to pop that into the chat. And again, we'll revisit that at the very end. And then we'll finish up with just a few closing comments. Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll ask Shlomia if you want to go ahead and begin your presentation and tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, sharing my screen. All right, did that, am I sharing?
Perfect, yep.
All right. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Eric and NAFC, for inviting me to do this, and thank you all for being here. I'm Shlomia. My background's in ecology. I recently founded the Indigenous Landscape Initiative, we call it Inland, and to bring Native American land stewardship practices back to land in the Northeast. I am not Native American, and I am blessed to be working with Native and non-Native people on this project. Eric invited me to give this webinar to introduce Inland to NAFC and the fire science community. I was first inspired to start Inland several years ago when I moved to New Hampshire, and I started learning about what Native peoples of this region did to steward the land, to care for the land in this region. And I learned about a beautiful set of practices that elegantly sustained healthy ecosystems and also met humans' needs on the land. And it felt to me like this is how we should be caring for the land now. And I learned also about damage and losses that are happening as a result of the loss of Native stewardship from so much of the land. And I learned about efforts that are going on to bring elements, individual pieces of this involved system to the land, like increasing the amount of fire on the land. And a lot of those efforts are focused on ecological restoration and less so on bringing that abundance of food to people. And use of pieces of this, these stewardship practices more for food production, like blueberry farmers burning their bushes, are much more focused on yields of individual food crops rather than on overall landscape ecological health. I also learned from Native Americans the importance not just of putting these practices onto the land, but also of people developing relationships of care and stewardship with the land. And I found that for the most part, I found Native people doing stewardship in some areas and non-Native people doing stewardship on land, but often on different land and separately. And with all that, I was driven to start the Indigenous Landscape Initiative. As part of that process, I started attending NAFC webinars, Fueling Collaboration, other fire science exchange webinars as part of my own learning up on fire science and becoming acquainted with the prescribed burn community. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you today. I'll share some of what I've learned about Indigenous stewardship practices, how they shape the landscape, how they provided great food for people and other things to meet people's needs. And I'll share some of my own observations around how these stewardship practices worked to meet human needs on the land and also sustain healthy ecosystems. We'll talk a little bit about what we're losing with the loss of native stewardship from so much of the land, and I'll tell you a little bit more about inland. So, jumping into stewardship, native peoples shaped the ecosystems across the continent. And by all accounts, their stewardship sustained healthy, beautiful landscapes that provided for the needs of all their inhabitants. People did a whole bunch of different things on the land to steward the land. So fire is a key practice or set of practices that took place across the continent, including in this region. Another practice is planting, where people planted not just annual agricultural crops, but also trees and things that we think of as forest species. And there are any number of species that owe their geographic distributions on the land today to native people planting them. And gathering is another set of practices where native peoples had and continue to have rules and norms and practices around gathering and hunting in ways that not just sustain the availability of what you're gathering rather than depleting it, but that in some cases even serve to increase it. So groundnut and black ash are just two examples of species that have been found to increase with Indigenous gathering. And there are many more stewardship practices, and we could talk a lot more about each of these. So today I'm going to focus on burning and how people of this region used fire to shape the landscape. But I want us to keep these other practices in mind because other types of stewardship also worked often alongside fire to shape the landscape. So looking further into burning, native peoples had many reasons to put fire on the land to help it meet their needs. To throw out a list of an important several, people burned to clear fields for agriculture, to clear travel ways and underbrush visibility, for that new green growth that comes after fire to feed and attract game species, to drive game sometimes in hunting, to produce plant food for people and other materials that people need, to reduce pest populations. And reducing wildfire hazard is certainly an effect of burning. I am not sure that people burned specifically for that purpose in this region, because I think that lots of other good reasons to burn probably covered the need to burn against wildfires, but it was certainly an effect, and many other reasons to burn. So when we look at this list, we see a lot of different good reasons to put fire on the land. And with at least some of these, also comes different types of fire, different frequencies and different timings, and fire in different places with these many different reasons to burn. So looking further at what fire looked like on the land, often many places were burned frequently. Often in the spring and the fall, and we have European colonial and explorer accounts and other sources of evidence for frequent spring-fall burning over a lot of the land. Not every area was burned as frequently, so there was variation there. Some areas were burned on rotation, where, for example, if blueberries are best burned every several years, but the blueberries are best the first couple years after a burn, then you burn different areas of blueberries different years, and you always have a great supply of blueberries. And there was other burning for specific plant or animal species. And a lot of burning took place in the upland areas, but burning was not limited to the upland. So you'd have burning in wetland areas, nearer to rivers, in floodplains. So overall, what we're seeing is a lot of fire on the land, a frequent fire landscape overall. And that also means that a lot of the areas are the light surface fires that come with frequent burning. And also a lot of variation across the landscape. So this brings us different landscape, different ecotypes. So you have denser forest where burning may be less frequent, to meadows with more frequent burning, different open woodland areas and other ecotypes. And the landscape as a whole is kind of a patchy landscape with different patches of different vegetation cover types. And that's called a mosaic landscape, and that is an important characteristic of an indigenous landscape of this region. Also, as these patches are burned and are in different stages of recovery from burn, with different shifts over time in people's population centers and activities, these patches shift from one type to another over time. You've got diversity in time, and that's called a shifting mosaic. So keeping in mind this diverse, shifting mosaic landscape, I want us to focus in on a particular ecotype or set of ecotypes that used to be extremely common across the landscape and has become very rare. And that's the fire-maintained open woodland landscape ecotype. And we have a lot of, for example, early European explorer accounts where they describe the land as widely spaced trees. They mention sometimes a grassy understory, or at least that there's no thicket, ease of travel. They often mention oak trees and sometimes other trees in the overstory. And this is their description of a lot of the land in different places. And they consistently, the early English explorers to this region, it consistently compare these areas to their parks. They say this is like our parks in England. And that is a phrase that's kind of been adopted. People talk about park-like stands or parklands. I want to dig into this a little bit and look at what this actually meant at the time when these English explorers were comparing these lands to their parks. Because it turns out that parks, as we know them today and as we've known them for the last couple hundred years, didn't exist in England at that time. So when they said the term park, a park in early mid-1600s England was a particular type of aristocratic hunting ground that had its own rules about it as a aristocratic hunting ground. It was an enclosed area that was mainly for concentrating and keeping and hunting mostly deer and also sometimes other species. And there was a particular distinctive set of visual and functional characteristics that was associated with parks. So parks were carefully maintained to have widely spaced trees, open areas for views to be aesthetically beautiful, to have grass, both for feeding the deer and for hunting fun, to have often oak trees and sometimes other nut-producing trees also to feed the deer, and to have particular areas of denser growth for deer cover. So when the early English explorers are consistently describing this landscape as being like their parks, that is what a park was for them at that time. Now, coming back over here, this land that was like this was formed and maintained by native peoples frequently burning on the land. And I want to look at how this ecotype produced with indigenous stewardship, produced a lot of food and other things for the people who lived here. So first of all, with a frequent fire system, you're favoring fire-tolerant species. And in many instances, that's food species. So in the overstory, you have oaks, hickories, chestnuts. Those are food producing trees. The understory is open. It is full of grass to feed your game. You have other plants, edible plants, medicinal plants, some berry bushes in some areas, and other food producing plants. Now, beyond the species composition, where you're forming an ecosystem that is full of food, you're also increasing how much food that those plants are producing. For example, when trees grow widely spaced, they grow in this kind of shape with what's called full deep crowns. And that kind of tree shape is excellent for nut production. So a tree that looks like this is going to produce a lot more food than the kinds of tree shapes that we have come to expect to see in our forests now. You're also burning off dead matter with frequent fire. You're renewing the growth. You're getting that new lush growth on a regular basis, and that is producing more of the plants and feeding your game species and other species that are on the land. You're also, in some cases, by burning, you're blackening the ground, and that can cause the ground, the blackened ground will absorb sunlight and can re-radiate it out as heat at night. So you're actually warming the air above the ground, and that can help to lengthen your growing season. It can help to prevent frost damage to flowering and fruiting parts. So these are ways that we're increasing the food production on this land. You're also doing that by how fire cycles nutrients. You're burning off dead matter and making those nutrients immediately available in the soil for plants. So one example is potassium that increases after a burn. It increases after prescribed fire in its availability on the land. And if you ask fruit tree and nut tree farmers, potassium is a crucial nutrient for their yields, for fruit formation, nut formation, how much production you get. It is also important in drought tolerance and frost tolerance and in resistance against pests and pathogens. And potassium, after a burn, it can increase for longer, but often it will increase for 1 to a few months after a burn. So with a spring burn, that's great timing for that season's nut production. Besides growing more vegetation and foods out of by cycling nutrients, you're actually increasing the nutritional quality of the food by how you're making those nutrients available. And by improving the nutritional quality of the food for your game, for example, you're improving their reproductive success. You're growing more and bigger game on your land. As these Patterson and Sassaman point out, you're increasing the carrying capacity of the land. So these are some ways where with this indigenous landscape, you're feeding people, you're feeding game, you're also meeting the needs of other species that are on the land with this diverse frequent fire landscape. Remember, our overall mosaic of the land, you're meeting the needs of species that need different types of cover. Ruffed grouse is one classic example. There are many of species that need different cover types and different vegetation types for different activities, different life cycle stages. So you're meeting their needs. And at the same time, you're providing other things that people need. In some areas, you're growing up dense stands of firewood, you're growing medicinal plants, other things that people need. Now, beyond the way that this indigenous frequent fire maintained landscape produces food and other things for the inhabitants that are on it, having this open frequent fire landscape does other things to make this land comfortable and great for people. You're reducing pests and pathogens through the action of fire. So this is just a few pests and pathogens that have been found to decrease with fire. That includes species that are annoying or dangerous to people, and that affect people's food, and that can infect and affect people's game. And burning takes place across the landscape. In many instances, it was also concentrated in the areas around towns. And so you're increasing your comfort and the health of the food that you're gathering closer to where people are. Besides the direct action of fire on pests and pathogens, you're also maintaining this open, predominantly open landscape, and that helps further against pest outbreaks. Thank you to Neil Gifford of the Albany Pine Bush Preserve for talking through this with me and sharing some of their own findings, where when trees have that space and when they have the access to the resources that they need, sunlight and especially water, they can then mount their own best defenses against a pest outbreak. So this in contrast with this type of forest that we see too much of now, where everybody's crowded. Nobody has access to the full resources that they need to mount a good defense against pests. Besides that, in this kind of closed, dense environment, the insects and other pests are swarming and are transmitting much more than you do on this open landscape. So speaking of benefits of this widely spaced open ecotype, it also helps with resistance against wildfires. So here we have advice from the National Fire Protection Association about spacing out the trees around your area to prevent wildfire from spreading to your house. And I like putting that next to our picture of a parkland where you also have those widely spaced trees. And on this diverse landscape, even if you have some areas of denser forest, it is broken up by these areas of widely spaced trees. So another piece of stewardship is that not every species likes fire. Not every area was burned. So you have areas where people didn't burn, and that is also part of stewardship. And as we mentioned, fire was concentrated in areas where people were closer to where people were most of the time. And so you have your more frequently gathered foods and your larger game species concentrated nearer to where people are spending more of their time. And then people can go farther away for other plant and animal species. So we've talked a bunch about benefits on the land to people, to food, to ecological health of this frequent fire indigenous landscape. Important to us now, and has been important in people living here at various times over the many thousands of years that Native folks have been stewarding the land, is that an indigenous landscape is a climate resilient landscape. We've seen already a number of the reasons why. So let's play this as a little bit of a game. So on one side, we have just three changes that we are seeing and are expecting to see more of: droughts, wildfires, and pests and pathogen outbreaks. And on the other side, we have a handful of characteristics of an indigenous landscape. So picture this as a child's worksheet or a matching game, and let's match them up. When we have frequent fire on the land, we're favoring fire-tolerant species, and that means our ecosystems have more resilience in the face of wildfires. A lot of those species, both overstory tree species and understory species, are also more drought tolerant. We're directly reducing the effects of pests and pathogens through fire. We're reducing fuels through frequent fire on the land. And remember our other stewardship practices, where we're gathering some of those fuels and taking them home to cook supper on them. That is also part of stewardship. When our landscape is characterized by widely spaced trees, that's going to help with drought and against wildfires and pests and pathogen spreads. When the landscape overall is diverse and patchy with different species compositions and different stages of burn recovery, that's going to help against wildfires and spread of pests and pathogens. And remember what we said about potassium: having those nutrients be regularly reavailable helps at least with droughts and pests and pathogens. So you can surely add more to either of these columns and more connections, but that is a start on ways that an indigenous landscape is a climate resilient landscape. And when our land is cared for in this way, when it has these climate resilient qualities, that means that the inhabitants of the land, the wildlife that's on the land, fares better through more of the changes that we're seeing. And when more of our own food and more of our own other needs are being met on a climate resilient landscape, that means that we fare better through more of the changes that we're seeing. So with this, I want to take a step back, and Native peoples did a huge amount over a lot of time to shape this land to meet their needs. And I want to look at how it worked for these stewardship practices that they developed and maintained to sustain human needs, to make this land great for people, and at the same time to sustain healthy, diverse, resilient ecosystems. An important part of how this worked is that the humans rely on the land, on the species that are on this land to meet their needs. So when we steward to meet our needs, we are stewarding for species that we need on the land and for the species that they need, and we're benefiting anybody who relies on either of those. And when we want a landscape that will reliably and in a resilient way to changes meet our needs, that means that we need to steward in a way that promotes health and resilience of the landscape as a whole. Also, humans are not specialists. We have a wide variety of needs. If you picture the diverse landscape, we need a whole supermarket, not just one department, to meet our needs. And that means that we're going to steward for ecological and biological diversity on the land. Another important piece of this is in some ways fundamental to indigeneity, and that's the idea of meeting our needs over time on this land, where part of meeting our needs on the land is that this land is also going to be what sustains us when we're old and what sustains our descendants, and we have to steward the land accordingly. And Native peoples have developed a very strong land ethic and perspective of relationship with the land and responsibility to the land. And That is important for many reasons, including that it helps with continuing these practices, conveying these practices over time, and also with figuring out what to do over time as circumstances, as conditions inevitably change. What do we do? What do we try? Having these principles that to guide people in how to think about our relationship and what to do on the land. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what we're losing with the loss of native stewardship from so much of the land. So let's talk first about mesification. This is NAFC. We like talking about mesification. So Nowacki and Abrams described a process where, with the loss of fire from a lot of the land and with other changes that have been happening over the last few hundred years, our landscape is going from one that is predominantly open, that is diverse on local and landscape scales, to one that is much more shady, much more closed, dense, and dominated more and more by non-fire species, and that is uniform, much more uniform across the landscape. So one thing that we're losing is we're losing ecosystems and species with a loss of Indigenous stewardship. These are just a few species that are endangered or gone in New Hampshire and are threatened or endangered more widely that directly rely on fire and a fire-maintained landscape. We're also losing a lot of food, as we've been saying. If we picture our diverse, mosaic, food productive supermarket of a landscape with Indigenous stewardship, with mesification and the loss of diversity in food, the changes that are happening, our supermarket is being taken over by the toilet paper aisle. We look at this type of land, this type of forest that's dark and dense and mesifying, and we say, where's all the food? Where did the food go? We're also losing out on wildfire safety, where wildfires are coming to the east, they are in the east, and when they are here, this is what they encounter. It is dense and uniform and not broken up by widely spaced areas, and it is more and more dominated by species that are vulnerable to fire. Besides wildfire, we're also losing other aspects of climate resilience. As we said, when with an Indigenous landscape, with an Indigenous stewardship caring for the land, we have more climate resilience in many ways. And what that means also is that when we aren't taking care of the land in those ways, we're losing out and we're a lot more vulnerable. We and the other inhabitants of the land are a lot more vulnerable to the changes that we're seeing. And we're also losing out on a land ethic and a perspective of relationship with the land, where now for many people, the dominant perspective is that our food comes from somewhere else. It comes from far away, and it comes from land that has been necessarily stripped of healthy ecology. And that our land here isn't supposed to provide for most of our needs unless we remove the ecology. And the perspective is one where humans and the land where we live are at odds with each other, where if we want healthy ecology, humans are supposed to stay out and we don't have a role in caring for the land. And that if we are to thrive, we need to do that at the expense of the other inhabitants of the land and healthy ecosystems. And that if they're to be healthy, we have to lose out in some way. And that's not a healthy perspective. And that's not a perspective to be taking into the future with us. And I much prefer a perspective put into practice where humans have a role on the land, in caring for the land, in stewarding the land in ways that benefit the land's health and benefit the other inhabitants of the land, and that the land in turn provides for our needs also. So when we talk about Native stewardship and bringing caring for the land and Indigenous stewardship practices back to the land, a principle that is important to inland and that I learned from our Native teachers is that everybody who lives on the land today has a responsibility to care for the land, to learn about the caring for the land and to care for the land. So, for example, Robin Kimmerer teaches that we need to learn from Indigenous perspectives on the land, and that that people who are non-native people on the land need to start acting like this is where we are, and that this is the land that sustains us, and that this is the land that will sustain our descendants, and this is the land that we have a responsibility to care for. And our advisor, Darren Ranko, teaches that we need to Native and non-Native people need to learn Native stewardship practices, and what the earth needs is for Native and non-Native people to work together to take care of our home for future generations. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about Inland. We are a new organization working with Native and non-Native communities of the region to bring Native stewardship practices back to land of the Northeast for ecological health restoration, producing food on smaller and larger scales and getting that food to people, building community, getting people out on the land to do stewardship, to learn about the land, build relationships with the land, relationships with each other in community. We are also know that there's a lot that we need to learn about these practices and how they work on the land as it is today and as it is changing. We're looking to partner for research on our spaces that we're doing stewardship. And another important piece of our work is that we're looking to learn from Native practices and perspectives and wisdom, not just on the practices that we put on the land, but these are perspectives that have sustained health on this land for a long time, and to learn from them in how we approach research, in how we approach community involvement and food access and other aspects of our work. So that is Inland in a walnut shell. Our work recently, we've been talking with different landholding groups, so land trusts, town conservation commissions, other groups in the area, about partnering with them to steward land that they own or manage. We've been building connections with Native and non-Native communities in the area, educating people about the idea of land stewardship and caring for the land, about Native land stewardship, about what's happening on our land now and how we need to care for it. We've been planning stewardship activities. We're working on raising funds to move this project forward. And we've been working on figuring out about making fire happen on the land in these different places. So I would love to hear from any of you who is interested in talking and getting involved. If you have suggestions or recommendations, connections for partners, land partners, for funding, if you're interested in partnering for research, if you have advice on anything else, if you're interested in getting involved, helping with planning, stewardship on the ground, getting fire on the land, or anything else you'd like to talk about, this, without the spaces, is my email address. And I would love to hear from you. You can also contact me or sign up for updates through our website. That's what I have. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to any questions and discussion. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Shalomia. Really appreciate that information. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will address those. I do have, while we're waiting for some entries into the chat, I do have one question for you, Shalomia. You said you've been working with these different groups. Is that has that mostly been taking place in New Hampshire, or have there been other states within the Northeast?
Yeah, thanks. So right now, the conversations around specific land partnerships that have moved the farthest are in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And I've had a couple of good conversations kind of right on the border of New Hampshire and Vermont, but mostly New Hampshire and Massachusetts so far. We're looking to work over time, develop this across the region.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thanks. And then I guess one other one too was and I didn't catch it because I started thinking about when you're talking about it, when you were talking about black ground earlier, and I think you believe that you're talking like nutrients and stuff. What was the process you said, like just above the ground? Like what is taking place to help with the soil? If you could if you remember kind of what you had said.
Yeah, so one piece, I'm not sure which one you're thinking of. So one piece is that when we burn the ground, it can look blacker, and that can cause the ground itself to absorb, right? Dark colors absorb more light and absorb more heat. And so during the day, the sunlight is absorbed more on that ground. Like when you're wearing a black t-shirt, you can be hotter than when you're wearing a white t-shirt in the sun. And that absorbed heat can then radiate back out over time. So it radiates back out at night, and that can help prevent some frost damage during times when you might have frost at certain times of day. And that can help protect early flowering and fruiting parts of the plant from frost damage. So you're increasing your food there. And then any number of nutrients through actually various processes, but I was mostly talking about by burning off dead plant matter in a fire, and then that dead matter comes and is deposited as ash on the land, and the products of fire that can make those nutrients in there immediately available, and you see increases in those nutrient availability in the soil immediately after a fire.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's great clarification there. Thank you. We do have a question from Anya. I work in invasive plant management and ecological restoration in Massachusetts and have specifically wondered about how to integrate fire management with some of the land trust held lands we engage with, since so many invasive woody plants aren't really negatively impacted by attempts at fire control. Does inland have an approach for invasive plants in these heavily degraded, poorly managed forests?
Yes, that is an excellent question. Thank you. So we are developing one. There is work around addressing invasives with fire. From what I have seen, the seasonality matters a lot to when and how you put fire on the ground. It's not the same as what you would do necessarily for some other purposes of stewarding the land with fire, and combination. So we're exploring different aspects of combining removal of invasives with then applying fire, and how that can work rather than just kind of fire on them. And we're exploring other ways of integrating, kind of in some ways, indigenous overall approaches to the land, to this new problem of invasive species, including, for example, planting other things. So removing invasives, and then at the same time planting in aggressive native relatively aggressive but not invasive species that can help to kind of replace those in exotic invasive, kind of get the ecosystem back in its groove. And then using kind of other action of frequent fires to bolster the diversity and health of the native species so that they can kind of come back in. And what I've seen when people are using this is that they're willing to tolerate kind of a presence of some of these would-be invasives on the land, where the invasives can continue to exist in potentially continue to exist in low numbers on the land, where the land as a whole is more robust and diverse, and therefore more able to resist those species being able to become actually invasive and taking over. So we're working on integrating those practices of fire in the right timing and ways to get those invasives, at the same time as removing them and replacing them with natives, and then using fire on the land to improve the diversity and robustness of the species that are supposed to be there. I don't know if that helps answer the question, and I'm happy to talk more about it also.
All right. Well, thank you, Shlomia. Another question from Andrew. How was the concept for the organization formulated? Did this come from Indigenous people's desires and needs directly?
That's a good question. When I first started learning about the different aspects of native stewardship on the land and what's been happening with the land, I kind of personally sort of hatched this idea in my mind and started kind of learning more, reading more writings by Native people about their relationships with the land and incorporating those ideas as I was formulating this kind of on my own. And then I bounced it to a small number of people, a close friend, kind of talking with a few people about this. And among the first 3 people I spoke with about it were Native people, and kind of hearing their takes on it, and they were very enthusiastic about it. And then as I've been developing it, I've been having more conversations, and the Native folks I've been talking with about it are excited about the idea. They're actually, the response that I've been often getting is that they're really happy that a non-Native person wants to take this on and do it, and make this happen. And then at this point, it's kind of been the design and concept and how we're going about this is being kind of iteratively developed through thinking and conversations with different people, Native people, non-Native people, land managers, land history people who are Native and non-Native, etc. Does that help?
Perfect. Thanks. Yep. So this one is just a quick comment and not a question, but it goes back to one of your points, Shlomia. This is from Russ Cohen. I did a lot of foraging for nuts, especially hazelnuts, black walnuts, and shagbark hickory nuts. I can confirm Shlomia's observation that the best nut gathering occurs where trees are growing in the open, where they get lots of light and not in the dense forest. I look for trees on the edge of a field or in the middle of a field. The one exception I know this to be is acorns. Oak trees can produce lots of acorns even in a dense forest. So that was just kind of a comment reiterating one of the points that you had made regarding foraging. Another question here from Suzanne. What you speak about is a collective Indigenous stewardship approach and requires co-development with Indigenous people. How will you propose this? How will you propose this actually happen with Indigenous communities?
That's a good question. That's a broad question. By the way, thank you, Russ, for your comment. Yeah, that is a broad question of how we are and will be developing it. Right now, what I have found is, so we're working with an advisor who is Indigenous and whose work is on land issues and land stewardship in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and how they can partner. And also science and environmental science is can be best co-developed with Native and non-Native people. So we're getting some really great guidance from him. And then right now working within communities that is and we have a particular spot of land. So when I've talked with people in different Native communities in the area, actual land partnership and first set of partnerships are going to be. And at that point, I loop back to those people I've been talking with and say, okay, we're here and we're in your area. Let's work on this. Let's work on this now, because then it becomes kind of more relevant rather than abstract as an idea. I don't know whether that helps.
Okay, yeah, you cut out there briefly, but I think we got most of it, and so I hope that answers Suzanne's question. Um, and then the last one here, and then we'll have to wrap up. Ryan Clark indicated a great presentation. Thank you. Have you connected with the Native Land Conservancy?
Yes, they're great. I've spoken with them and I look forward to speaking with them more about this and about their work. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, he had put a link in the chat as well, just in case, but it sounds like you've got that
Okay.
covered. So
Thank you.
okay, so with that, I did put in the if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, Shalomia, I'm gonna pop something on the screen here. All right, so just a couple closing thoughts here. One, I mentioned, I put in the chat the website for the inland website that you can take a look at, and just we have recorded this session, and so if you wanted to go back and take a look at it today, it will be on the NAVSE website later this afternoon. And you can see on the screen there, I have the NAVSE website address, firesciencenorthatlantic.org. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we have an events calendar, and I would encourage you to head to our website to check out any other future webinars that we have coming up. And then also, if you want to get information related to webinars sent to your email address, we do frequent newsletters. And so you can sign up for our newsletter on our website, firesciencenorthatlantic.org, or you can hit up that QR code and that will get you access to our newsletter sign up page. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to mention is that we have a very short when you close the browser, a very short survey pops up. It takes less than a minute. I think on a previous Zoom webinar, the stats said it took people on average 33 seconds to fill out. So it's just 4 simple questions that if you could fill that out at the end, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, just wanted to thank you again, Shalomia, for the excellent presentation. Very engaging, very thought-provoking. Really enjoyed it. And I want to thank everybody who participated today as well. We really appreciate that. We'll keep the session open for just another quick minute or two in case there's any sort of last-minute questions. Otherwise, thank you again, everybody, for joining, and we hope you have a great day.